The crimson sand of Zerion Prime stretched endlessly under twin suns, painting the battlefield in shades of blood and shadow. Commander Zeth Kara of the Galactic Alliance stood atop the observation platform, his four eyes scanning the horizon, where smoke still rose from the latest skirmish. The war against the Devourers had been raging for 3 cycles now, and every species in the Alliance had contributed their finest warriors. Every species except one. Human Zeth Kara's mandibles clicked with frustration as he remembered the heated debates in the High Council chambers. The humans had joined the Alliance only recently, barely 50 rotations ago, and were considered primitive by most standards. Their technology was crude, their ships outdated, and their weapons laughably simple compared to the plasma rifles and quantum disruptors used by civilized species. When the Devourer threat emerged from the dark void between galaxies, consuming entire worlds and leaving nothing but empty husks behind, the Council had politely suggested that humans remain in their protected sectors, far from the front lines. Commander, his aide, a crystalline being from Praxis 7, chimed beside him. The human delegation has arrived for the briefing. Zeth Kara suppressed a groan. Another diplomatic meeting where the humans would undoubtedly volunteer their services and be gently refused. He had participated in dozens of such meetings, watching the strange bipedal creatures argue passionately about their desire to help, their faces turning various shades of red as their emotions peaked. It was almost endearing, like watching younglings play at war. The briefing room buzzed with conversation as representatives from 12 different species gathered around the holographic display showing Devourer movement patterns. The creatures were advancing on 3 fronts, their dark ships moving like hungry shadows across star systems. Each victory came at a terrible cost. Entire fleets reduced to scrap metal, planets stripped of all life in mere hours. The human delegation entered quietly, led by a woman with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Admiral Sarah Chen, if Zeth Kara remembered correctly. Behind her walked 3 others, all wearing simple blue uniforms that looked primitive compared to the ornate battle armor and biosuits worn by other Alliance members. Honored allies, Admiral Chen spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the room despite her small stature. We've reviewed the tactical data you've shared, and we have a proposal. General Vorthak, a towering reptilian from Draconis, let out a rumbling laugh. Admiral Chen, with all respect to your species, this is not a conflict for developing civilizations. The Devourers have consumed worlds that housed species with technology thousands of cycles more advanced than yours. Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that made Zeth Kara feel oddly uncomfortable. General, we understand your concerns, but we believe our unique perspective might offer advantages that haven't been considered. Unique perspective. Admiral Quintix, whose energy-based form shimmered blue-white, pulsed with what Zeth Kara recognized as amusement. What could a species that has barely left their home system offer against enemies that devour galaxies? One of the humans behind Chen, a younger male with dark skin and calloused hands, stepped forward slightly. Colonel Marcus Washington, according to the files. If I may, Admiral, he said to Chen, who nodded. We've studied your engagement reports. The Devourers are incredibly advanced, yes, but they follow predictable patterns. They're methodical, efficient, logical. They approach warfare like a mathematical equation. And that observation helps us how? Vorthak's tail swished with impatience. Because humans don't fight like a mathematical equation, Washington replied simply. We fight dirty. The room fell silent. Several species exchanged glances, their universal translators struggling with the colloquial phrase. Admiral Chen activated her personal holoprojector, displaying a simple 3-dimensional map. The Devourers' greatest strength is also their weakness. They're so advanced, so sophisticated in their thinking, that they can't comprehend truly primitive tactics. When every other species in the galaxy fights with energy weapons and quantum shields, sometimes the best strategy is to go back to basics. Zeth Kara leaned forward, genuinely curious despite himself. What do you mean by basics, Admiral? Kinetic weapons, chemical explosives, biological warfare, psychological operations, things so simple and crude that an advanced intelligence might overlook them entirely. Chen's fingers danced across her controls, showing various human military technologies. We've been perfecting the art of asymmetric warfare for millennia. We know how to fight enemies that are bigger, stronger, and more advanced than we are because that's been our entire history. The third human, A woman with silver hair and cybernetic implants over one eye spoke up. Dr. Elena Vasquez, xenobiological warfare specialist. We've identified 17 different biological agents that could potentially disrupt devourer physiology, based on the tissue samples recovered from Kepler Station. None of them require advanced technology to deploy. Biological warfare? The representative from Harmony, a peaceful aquatic species, recoiled visibly. Such methods are forbidden by the Galactic Convention. The Galactic Convention was written before the Devourers started eating entire planets, Washington said grimly. Sometimes you have to choose between your principles and your survival. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Most Alliance species had evolved beyond such primitive concepts as biological warfare, chemical weapons, and guerrilla tactics. Their conflicts were conducted with honor, following established rules of engagement that had been refined over millions of cycles. Zeth Kara found himself studying the humans more carefully. There was something in their posture, their way of speaking, that suggested depths of experience with conflict that made him uneasy. These weren't the innocent, primitive creatures he had assumed them to be. You're suggesting we abandon centuries of civilized warfare to adopt savage tactics? Admiral Quintix's form flickered with indignation. Chen's smile was sharp as a blade. Admiral, when an enemy is trying to exterminate all life in the galaxy, I'm suggesting we use every weapon in our arsenal. And humanity's arsenal runs much deeper than most species realize. The fourth human, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Commander Jiang Wei, according to his nameplate, bore scars that looked both old and extensive. The Devourers think they understand warfare because they've encountered advanced civilizations. But they've never fought a species that climbed to the top of their food chain by being the most effective killers their planet ever produced. They've never faced an enemy that treats war not as an extension of politics, but as an art form. An art form? Forsyth sounded skeptical. Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, Napoleon, Alexander, Rommel, Patton? Zhang listed names that meant nothing to the assembled aliens. We've been studying warfare for our entire recorded history, not as a necessary evil, but as a science, as a craft to be perfected. Admiral Chen closed her holoprojector. We're not asking to lead your fleets or command your forces. We're asking for the chance to do what humans do best, find the enemy's weakness and exploit it with extreme prejudice. Give us 3 ships, a small crew, and operational freedom. Let us show you what primitive tactics can accomplish against advanced enemies. The silence stretched for long moments. Finally, High Admiral Kethvar, the elderly Valerian who led the Alliance forces, spoke in his whispering voice that somehow carried to every corner of the room. 3 ships, Admiral Chen. But understand that failure will likely mean not just your deaths, but the deaths of everyone aboard those vessels. Chen's smile grew wider, and for the first time, Zeth Kara felt a chill run down his spine despite the room's warm temperature. Admiral, where we come from, those are the only kind of odds worth taking. 2 months later, Zeth Kara stood in the command center of the Alliance flagship Eternal Vigilance, watching sensor displays that showed nothing but empty space where 3 human vessels had vanished into the void. The Terran ships, Indomitable, Retribution, and Wolverine had departed with minimal fanfare, carrying crews of barely 300 humans total against an enemy that had destroyed battle groups numbering in the thousands. Most of the Alliance command staff had written them off as a noble but futile gesture, a way for the primitive species to die with honor rather than live with the shame of sitting out the war. Zeth Kara had found himself oddly disappointed by this cynical assessment, having been genuinely curious about what the humans might accomplish. Sir, his communications officer announced, we're receiving scattered reports from our deep space monitoring stations. There's unusual activity in the Proxima Nebula sector. Zeth Kara's primary eyes focused on the tactical display, while his secondary eyes continued scanning other readouts. The Proxima Nebula was deep in contested space, an area where Devourer scout fleets had been conducting reconnaissance for weeks. Define unusual. Multiple explosions detected. Energy signatures that don't match known Devourer or Alliance weapons. And, the officer paused, manipulating controls with his tentacles. We're picking up what appears to be a human distress signal. Before Zeth Kara could respond, the main communication array crackled to life. The voice that emerged was unmistakably human, speaking in heavily accented Standard Galactic. This is Colonel Washington aboard the Indomitable. Any Alliance vessels receiving this transmission, please respond. We have valuable intelligence regarding Devourer fleet movements and tactical vulnerabilities. The command center fell silent. General Vorthak, who had been reviewing casualty reports from the latest failed offensive, looked up sharply. They survived? How long have they been in contested space? 8 weeks, General, came the reply from the communication station. Admiral Quintix materialized beside the main display, her energy form flickering with what Zethkara had learned to recognize as surprise. 8 weeks in Devourer territory with only 3 small ships? Impossible. Zethkara activated the response channel. Colonel Washington, this is Commander Zethkara aboard the Eternal Vigilance. Please state your position and condition. Commander, good to hear a friendly voice. We're currently. There was a pause, filled with what sounded like consultation, with other crew members, approximately 40 parsecs inside the Proxima Nebula. All 3 ships operational, minimal casualties. We've been conducting reconnaissance and harassment operations against Devourer supply lines. Harassment operations? Vorthak's voice carried a note of disbelief. Against the Devourers? A new voice joined the transmission, recognizably Admiral Chen. General Vorthak, I presume. Yes, harassment operations. It turns out that when you've spent most of your existence fighting wars against overwhelming odds, you develop certain skill sets that translate well to asymmetric naval combat. Zethkara exchanged glances with his staff. The confidence in Chen's voice was unmistakable, but what she was claiming seemed impossible. Admiral, perhaps you could elaborate on these operations for our intelligence division? Gladly, Commander. Dr. Vasquez, would you care to begin? The scientist's voice was clear and precise. We've conducted 17 separate engagements with Devourer forces over the past 8 weeks. Rather than attempting direct confrontation, we've focused on what humans call hit-and-run tactics. Small-scale attacks designed to inflict maximum psychological and logistical damage while minimizing our own exposure. Psychological damage? Admiral Quintix pulsed rapidly. The Devourers are cybernetic entities with quantum-processed consciousness. They don't experience psychology as organic species understand it. That's what we thought too, Dr. Vasquez replied with what sounded like amusement. Until we realize that their quantum processing creates something analogous to pattern recognition anxiety. They become increasingly inefficient when faced with unpredictable variables. Commander Zhang's voice joined the conversation. In practical terms, we've been using modified mining charges to destroy their supply convoys. Nothing sophisticated, just good old-fashioned chemical explosives rigged to detonate when triggered by proximity sensors. The Devourer's energy shields are designed to deflect advanced weaponry, not chunks of metal and rock moving at high velocity. Zethkara felt his secondary hearts beginning to beat faster. You're saying you've successfully engaged Devourer convoys with primitive explosives? 17 times, Washington confirmed. We've also been using what we call ghost tactics. Our ships are small enough to hide in asteroid fields and nebula formations. We've been following their scout fleets, mapping their patrol patterns, and identifying weaknesses in their formation structures. But their sensors should detect you easily, protested the Eternal Vigilance's science officer, a multi-tentacled being from Cerebros Prime. Chen's voice carried a note of what could only be described as predatory satisfaction. Their sensors are designed to detect threats. We've modified our ships to register as space debris, lower power output, irregular movement patterns, and what Commander Zhang calls electromagnetic camouflage. Our ancestors used to hide from prey by covering themselves in mud and staying perfectly still. Same principle, different environment. The conversation was interrupted by alarms beginning to sound throughout the command center. Zethkara's communications officer spoke urgently. Sir, we're receiving priority alerts from the Kepler defense grid. Massive Devourer fleet movement detected. They're advancing on 3 separate fronts simultaneously. The main tactical display illuminated with red markers indicating enemy positions. It was the largest Devourer force movement they had detected since the war began, with hundreds of ships moving in coordinated formation toward Alliance territory. Admiral Chen, Zethkara spoke quickly. "We're detecting a major enemy offensive. You need to return to Alliance space immediately." There was a long pause before Chen responded, and when she did, her voice carried a tone that made Zethkara's skin crawl. "Commander, with respect, I think you have that backwards. This is exactly the kind of opportunity we've been waiting for." "Opportunity?" General Vorthak's growl carried clearly across the channel. "Admiral, that fleet could eliminate every Alliance ship in this sector." "Only if they reach Alliance territory," Washington interjected. "But what if they never make it that far?" "Doctor," Vasquez's voice joined the discussion, and there was something in her tone that reminded Zethkara of a hunter who had finally cornered her prey. "We've spent 8 weeks studying their logistics, their supply requirements, their communication protocols. A fleet that size requires massive resource support. They're vulnerable during movement." "What are you proposing?" Admiral Quintix asked, though her energy form was already shifting to colors that indicated deep concern. "We're proposing to do what humans have always done when faced with a superior enemy," Chen replied. "We're going to hit them where they're not looking in ways they won't expect, with weapons they won't understand until it's too late." Zhang's voice carried a grim satisfaction. "The Devourers think in terms of direct confrontation and superior firepower. They expect their enemies to meet them in open battle, shield to shield and weapon to weapon. They don't expect their enemies to sabotage their fuel supplies, corrupt their navigation systems, and turn their own ships into weapons against them." "You're talking about guerrilla warfare on an interstellar scale," Zethkara said, barely believing what he was hearing. "We're talking about winning," Chen replied simply. "Commander, we need you to do something for us, something that's going to require you to trust human tactical judgment even when it seems completely insane." Zethkara looked around the command center at his fellow officers. Every face, whether scaled, crystalline, or energy-based, showed the same expression of uncertainty mixed with desperate hope. The Alliance had been losing this war slowly, but surely. Conventional tactics had failed repeatedly against Devourer superiority. "What do you need, Admiral?" "We need you to retreat. Pull back every Alliance ship in this sector and make it look like you're running scared. Draw their attention away from the nebula and give us operational freedom." "You want us to appear weak?" Vorthak sounded offended. "We want you to appear exactly like what the Devourers expect, a technologically inferior species that relies on brute force tactics. While they're chasing your fleet, they won't be watching their flanks, their supply lines, or their rear guard." There was something in Chen's voice that made Zethkara think of ancient predators from his homeworld, creatures that had learned to use their prey's own instincts against them. "How long do you need?" he asked. 72 standard hours. After that, either will have given you an opening to counterattack or— Chen paused. "Well, after that it won't matter anyway." Zethkara made a decision that would haunt his dreams for years to come. "Understood, Admiral. The Alliance fleet will begin retreat maneuvers immediately. May your ancestors guide your path." "Commander," Chen's final transmission was barely audible over increasing static. "Where we're going, we'll be making our own path." The channel went dead, leaving the command center in heavy silence. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled slowly in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the cosmic drama unfolding among the species that had learned to travel between them. Somewhere in that vast darkness, 3 small human ships prepared to face an enemy that had devoured civilizations spanning millions of years. Zethkara began issuing retreat orders and tried not to think about what kind of species produced warriors who spoke of impossible odds the way others might discuss favorable weather. The Devourer hive mind, designated consumption vector prime, calculated success, probability at 97.3% as its fleet advanced through the void toward Alliance territory. The organic species would retreat, as they always did, and their worlds would be stripped of all useful matter within standard processing cycles. Resistance was futile when faced with technological superiority that spanned galactic epochs. The calculation shifted to 97.1% when unusual energy signatures were detected in the Proxima Nebula, but such minor fluctuations were well within acceptable parameters. The primitive Alliance species occasionally conducted desperate reconnaissance missions. These posed no meaningful threat to Devourer operations. Aboard the human vessel Wolverine, hidden deep within an asteroid field, Chief Engineer Maria Santos watched her jury-rigged sensors track the massive enemy fleet. Her modifications to the ship's systems would have horrified any Alliance engineer. Crude magnetic field generators stolen from mining equipment. Chemical explosive charges cannibalized from construction tools. Electromagnetic pulse devices built from spare parts and human ingenuity. Wolverine too indomitable, she spoke into her communicator. Count confirmed. 237 enemy vessels in the main formation. Escorts are maintaining standard protective perimeter. Exactly as predicted. Admiral Chen's voice crackled back through the static-filled channel. Confirmed, Wolverine. Retribution, status report? Commander James Mitchell responded from the third human ship, his Scottish accent thick with concentration. We've identified the command vessel, Admiral. Massive ship at the formation center, approximately 12 kilometers long. Energy output suggests it's housing their primary coordination systems. Outstanding, Chen replied. Wolverine, are your presents ready for delivery? Santos grinned at the euphemism. The presents were something no civilized species would have conceived of. Asteroids hollowed out and packed with nuclear devices, rigged to look like natural space debris. Humans had been hiding weapons inside innocent objects since they first learned to sharpen sticks. Ready and waiting, Admiral. Our delivery service guarantees satisfaction. 14 light minutes away, the Alliance fleet continued its orchestrated retreat, drawing the Devourer attention exactly as planned. Commander Zethakara monitored the tactical display with growing anxiety, watching red markers advance relentlessly toward blue ones. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and fight, but he had given his word to trust human judgment. Sir, his tactical officer reported, the Devourer fleet is maintaining pursuit velocity. They're completely focused on our ships. Good, Zethakara replied, though the word tasted bitter. Running from battle went against every warrior tradition his species had developed over millennia. Maintain current course and speed. Let them think they're herding us toward destruction. Meanwhile, in the depths of the nebula, Dr. Elena Vasquez was conducting an experiment that would have been considered impossible by every military academy in the galaxy. She was attempting to hack into Devourer communication networks using methods that predated quantum computing by several thousand years. Pattern recognition, she muttered to herself, fingers dancing across a keyboard that looked ancient compared to the holographic interfaces used by other species. Every intelligence, no matter how advanced, has to process information sequentially. And if you're processing sequentially, you can be interrupted. The virus she was preparing was elegantly simple, a feedback loop disguised as routine stellar navigation data. When the Devourer ships received it, their quantum processors would attempt to analyze the information and become trapped in an endless calculation cycle. Not enough to shut them down completely, but sufficient to slow their reaction times by precious milliseconds. Dr. Vasquez to Admiral Chen, she announced. The confusion package is ready for transmission. Excellent. Colonel Washington, are your teams in position? Washington's voice came from the Indomitable, where he was coordinating what humans called a special operations mission. Affirmative, Admiral. We've got boarding parties prepped and ready. Modified EVA suits, kinetic weapons, and enough determination to make this interesting. The concept of boarding actions had been abandoned by most civilized species centuries ago, when ship-to-ship combat became dominated by energy weapons fired across vast distances. The idea of actually sending soldiers in spacesuits to physically board enemy vessels was considered not just primitive, but suicidal. Of course, humans had built their entire military tradition around actions that other species considered suicidal. Chen to all ships. The Admiral's voice carried across all three vessels. Execute Phase 1 in 5 minutes. Remember, we're not trying to destroy their fleet. We're trying to create chaos, confusion, and fear. Make them doubt their own tactical superiority. Santos activated her improvised asteroid launcher, a device that would have made Alliance engineers weep. It was essentially a magnetic catapult built into the asteroid field, designed to fling her weaponized rocks toward the Devourer fleet at velocities that would make them appear to be natural space debris until the moment of impact. First package away, she reported, watching her sensors track the modified asteroid as it began its journey toward the enemy formation. Estimated time to delivery, 47 minutes. Dr. Vasquez began transmitting her virus, disguising it within standard stellar cartography updates that Devourer ships routinely intercepted and analyzed. Confusion package uploaded and propagating through their network. Initial penetration successful. The Devourer hive mind began detecting anomalies in its calculations. Minor at first. Barely perceptible delays in processing speed that fell within normal variance parameters. But as more ships received the corrupted data, the delays began to compound exponentially. For the first time in its existence spanning millions of years, the hive mind experienced something analogous to doubt. Washington to all teams. The colonel's voice was calm despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Target vessels identified. Remember, we're not trying to capture these ships. We're trying to convince them that nowhere is safe. His boarding parties launched from concealed positions throughout the asteroid field, using EVA suits modified with primitive rocket boosters and electromagnetic grappling systems. They would attach to Devourer hulls like parasites, cut through using thermal lances, and conduct what military historians would later call the most audacious boarding actions in recorded history. The first weaponized asteroid struck a Devourer escort vessel 47 minutes later, exactly as Santos had calculated. The nuclear detonation tore through shields designed to deflect energy weapons but never tested against simple kinetic impacts followed by atomic explosions. The hive mind's confusion algorithms deepened as it attempted to analyze the attack. Energy signatures indicated primitive nuclear fission devices, technology so ancient that its databases had no relevant defensive protocols. The projectile had appeared to be natural space debris until the moment of detonation. How does one defend against rocks? A second asteroid struck minutes later, then a third. Each impact was followed by electromagnetic pulse effects that disrupted Devourer communication networks already struggling with Dr. Vasquez's viral infection. Ships began losing coordination with the hive mind, their quantum processors overwhelmed by cascading calculation errors. Multiple breaches on the command vessel, Washington reported as his boarding teams cut through Devourer hull plating. Teams Alpha and Beta are inside, beginning sabotage operations. Inside the massive command ship, human soldiers moved through corridors designed for cybernetic beings, their primitive kinetic weapons devastatingly effective against enemies who had never faced projectile weaponry. Bullets passed through energy shields as if they didn't exist, while chemical explosives created havoc in systems designed to withstand plasma bombardments. The Devourer crew had no tactical protocols for fighting enemies inside their own ships. Their weapons were designed for space combat, not corridor fighting. Their minds, linked to the collective consciousness, couldn't adapt quickly enough to threats that operated outside all known parameters. Chen to Alliance Fleet, the Admiral's voice rang across the communication channels. Phase 1 complete. Enemy fleet is experiencing significant disruption. Recommend immediate counterattack while they're disorganized. Aboard the Eternal Vigilance, Zethkara watched his sensors register impossible readings. The massive Devourer fleet, which had been advancing in perfect formation just hours before, was now scattered and confused. Ships were changing course randomly, communications were fragmenting, and several vessels were showing signs of internal explosions. All Alliance ships, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of command and the wonder of witnessing something unprecedented. Reverse course. Full attack formation. Target the enemy fleet while they're vulnerable. As the Alliance ships turned to engage, Admiral Chen's final transmission carried a note of grim satisfaction. Commander Zethkara, you're about to see what happens when an irresistible force meets a completely unpredictable object. The Devourers have spent eons perfecting their superiority against civilized warfare. Unfortunately for them, humans never learned to be civilized. The quantum consciousness that was the Devourer hive mind experienced its first emotion in millions of years of existence: fear. Not of superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but of an enemy that fought with methods so primitive, so chaotic, so utterly unpredictable, that no amount of advanced calculation could anticipate their next move. For the first time in galactic history, the Devourers began to retreat from a battle they had expected to win easily. And in the depths of space, 3 small human ships prepared to show the galaxy exactly why Earth had never been conquered by any species that evolved on it. 3 days after the Battle of Proxima Nebula, as military historians would later name it, The Alliance High Council convened an emergency session aboard the orbital station Concordia. Representatives from 47 different species filled the amphitheater, their varied forms creating a rainbow of scales, chitin, energy patterns, and crystalline structures. All were focused on the holographic display at the chamber's center, which showed tactical recordings of the impossible human victory. High Chancellor Vexthana, her ancient crystalline form refracting light in patterns that indicated deep contemplation, spoke first. Let us review what our sensors recorded. 3 human vessels, total crew complement of 300, defeated a devourer fleet of over 200 ships using what can only be described as... She paused, her translation matrix struggling with the concept, primitive improvisation. General Vorthak shifted his massive reptilian bulk, still clearly struggling to accept what he had witnessed. The recordings show nuclear devices hidden inside asteroids, computer viruses transmitted through stellar navigation data, and soldiers with projectile weapons conducting boarding actions. These are tactics that most species abandon before achieving interstellar flight. Ambassador Quintal of the Harmony Collective, whose aquatic form moved gracefully within its environmental suit, bubbled with distress. But the effectiveness is undeniable. The Devourer formation was completely disrupted. Their retreat was so chaotic that our pursuing fleets captured 17 abandoned vessels. Admiral Quintix materialized beside the central display, her energy pattern flickering with colors that indicated profound confusion. The captured ships show evidence of something unprecedented. The Devourer crews abandoned them not because of damage, but because of what appears to be panic. A collective consciousness that has existed for millions of years experienced something analogous to terror. In the observation gallery, Commander Zethkara watched the proceedings with growing unease. He had been personally involved in the battle, had witnessed the human tactics firsthand, and yet he still struggled to comprehend what he had seen. The humans sat quietly in their designated section, Admiral Chen listening with apparent interest as if the discussion concerned some other species entirely. Perhaps, suggested Dr. Kerrigan from the Scientific Collective, we should hear directly from those responsible. Admiral Chen, would you enlighten us about your tactical approach? Chen rose gracefully, her simple uniform contrasting sharply with the ornate ceremonial dress worn by other delegates. Honored representatives, I believe you're overcomplicating what was essentially a straightforward military operation. We identified enemy weaknesses and exploited them using available resources. Straightforward? Chancellor Vexithana's crystalline form shifted to patterns indicating disbelief. Admiral, you used rocks as weapons against ships equipped with quantum shielding. Yes, Chen replied with what Zethkara was beginning to recognize as characteristically human matter-of-factness. Their shields were designed to deflect energy-based attacks. They had no protocols for dealing with kinetic impacts followed by nuclear detonation. Colonel Washington stood beside his admiral. If I may add, Chancellor, this represents a fundamental difference in military philosophy. Most species develop increasingly sophisticated weapons and defenses in what humans call an arms race. But sometimes the most effective approach is to step outside that race entirely. Dr. Vasquez activated a small holographic projector, displaying what appeared to be ancient human military documents. Our species has extensive historical records of technologically inferior forces defeating superior enemies through asymmetric tactics. The Vietnamese against the Americans, the Afghans against the Soviets, the Finnish against the Russians. When you can't match your enemy's strength, you force them to fight on terms they haven't prepared for. But these were conflicts between members of the same species, protested Ambassador Quintal. Surely the principles don't apply to interstellar warfare. Commander Zhang stepped forward, his scarred face bearing an expression that made several delegates unconsciously retreat. Ambassador, with respect, warfare is warfare regardless of the environment. The fundamentals don't change just because you're fighting in space instead of on planetary surfaces. Fundamentals. General Vorthak's tail swished dangerously. What fundamentals could possibly apply to both primitive planetary conflicts and advanced space combat? Zhang's smile was sharp enough to cut vacuum. Fear, confusion, and the breakdown of command authority. Every enemy, no matter how advanced, becomes vulnerable when they stop thinking clearly. Our job was to make the Devourers afraid, confused, and uncertain. High Chancellor Vexthana's form pulsed with skeptical patterns. The Devourers are a collective consciousness. They don't experience emotions as organic species understand them. That's what we thought too, Dr. Vasquez interjected, until we realized that consciousness itself creates vulnerability. Even quantum-based intelligence requires processing time, decision trees, and resource allocation. Disrupt those processes, and even the most advanced mind becomes ineffective. She gestured to her holographic display, showing brain scan patterns that looked disturbing, similar to neural activity. The devourer hive mind operates like a massive distributed computer network. But networks can be hacked, especially when they're not expecting attacks from sources they consider irrelevant. Admiral Chen reclaimed the floor, her voice carrying a tone that made Zeth Kara think of patient teachers explaining simple concepts to slow students. The devourers have spent eons fighting advanced civilizations. They know how to counter energy weapons, quantum torpedoes, and gravitational manipulators. They have no experience with enemies who use chemical explosives, kinetic weapons, and biological warfare. Biological warfare? The representative from Meridian Prime, a floating gaseous entity, contracted with alarm. You used biological weapons against them? We used everything, Washington replied without hesitation. Sonic disruption devices to interfere with their communication frequencies, electromagnetic pulse weapons to overload their sensor arrays, psychological warfare to make them doubt their own tactical assessments. Psychological warfare against a collective consciousness? General Vorthak's disbelief was evident in every syllable. Zhang's expression grew grim. General, the most effective weapons humans have ever developed aren't bombs or bullets. They're ideas. The idea that nowhere is safe. The idea that your enemy might be hiding anywhere, using anything as a weapon. The idea that your technological superiority means nothing if your opponent refuses to play by the same rules. A long silence fell over the chamber as the implications of his words sank in. Representatives who had spent their civilization's entire existence developing increasingly sophisticated forms of warfare were confronting species that treated unpredictability as a tactical doctrine. Finally, Chancellor Vexathana spoke again, her voice carrying harmonics that indicated deep disturbance. You're describing a form of warfare that seems to abandon all civilized conventions. What prevents such tactics from being used against peaceful species? Admiral Chen's expression grew serious for the first time during the discussion. Chancellor, that's a question that gets to the heart of who humans are as a species. We've spent our entire history fighting each other, yes. But we've also developed elaborate codes of conduct, rules of engagement, and concepts of honor that govern when and how we wage war. The laws of armed conflict, Colonel Washington added. Geneva Convention, Hague Convention, rules for treatment of prisoners, protection of civilians, proportional response. Humans learned long ago that unrestrained warfare destroys not just enemies but the warriors themselves. Dr. Vasquez nodded agreement. We use these tactics against the devourers because they've declared their intention to consume all life in the galaxy. That makes this an existential conflict where conventional rules don't apply, but against species seeking coexistence rather than extermination. We fight very differently. Or preferably, Chen concluded, we don't fight at all. Humans are capable of cooperation, diplomacy, trade, and peaceful coexistence, but when faced with an enemy that offers only the choice between submission and extinction, we become something else entirely. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different quality. Where before there had been confusion and disbelief, now there was something approaching understanding mixed with an emotion that most species in the room had rarely experienced: intimidation. Ambassador Quintel bubbled nervously within his environmental suit. Admiral, I must ask directly, what is it that makes humans so effective at this type of warfare? What evolutionary pressures created such tactical flexibility? Chen's smile returned, but now it carried undertones that made Zeth Kara's primary heart skip beats. Ambassador, I think that's a question better answered by one of our xenobiologists, Dr. Vasquez. The scientist activated her holographic display again, this time showing an image of Earth from orbit, its blue and green surface looking deceptively peaceful in the starlight. Earth is what we call a death world, although we didn't realize how unusual our home planet was until we met other species. Nearly everything on our world evolved to kill nearly everything else. The atmosphere is corrosive to most forms of life. The weather patterns are violently unstable, and the ecosystem is based on predation rather than cooperation. She gestured to images of Earth's wildlife: lions stalking prey, Sharks hunting in dark waters, storms ravaging coastlines, volcanoes erupting with devastating force. Humans didn't just evolve on this world. We conquered it. We became the apex predator on a planet where virtually everything was trying to kill us. We learned to hunt animals larger and stronger than ourselves, survive in environments that should have been lethal, and adapt to threats that changed faster than genetic evolution could keep pace with. The images shifted to show human settlements, cities rising from deserts, civilizations flourishing in Arctic wastes, communities thriving in areas regularly devastated by natural disasters. But most importantly, Dr. Vasquez continued, we learned to fight each other. For thousands of years, the greatest threat to any human was other humans. We developed warfare not as an occasional necessity, but as a constant reality. Every innovation in human technology has been tested in combat against enemies who thought exactly like we did. Commander Zhang stepped forward one final time. Dr. Vasquez is being modest. She's not telling you the most important part. The reason humans are so effective at asymmetric warfare isn't just because we evolved in a hostile environment. It's because we learned to love the challenge. The silence that followed his words was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the station seemed muted, as if the very air had decided to listen more carefully. What do you mean? Chancellor Vexathana asked, though her translation matrix suggested she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. Zhang's scarred face broke into a grin that would have looked perfectly at home on the face of an ancient human warrior preparing for battle. I mean that when faced with impossible odds against overwhelming enemies, most species despair. Humans? We get excited. 6 months after the Proxima Nebula victory, the war had taken on an entirely different character. Devourer fleets, once predictably methodical in their advance patterns, now moved erratically through space, conducting extensive sensor sweeps for threats that might not exist and maintaining defensive formations, even in supposedly secure territory. The hive mind had learned to fear shadows. Commander Zeth Kara stood in the war room aboard the Eternal Vigilance, studying holographic displays that showed the current strategic situation. Red markers indicating devourer positions were scattered and fragmented, no longer forming the confident advancing waves that had characterized the early war. Blue markers representing Alliance forces were pursuing opportunities that would have been impossible just cycles ago. But it was the green markers that drew his attention, small clusters scattered throughout the operational theater, indicating human task forces conducting what they euphemistically called special operations. Each marker represented another nightmare for Devourer, commanders trying to maintain any semblance of predictable defensive strategy. Sir, his communications officer announced, we're receiving a priority transmission from Admiral Chen. Audio only, heavily encrypted. Zeth Kara nodded, activating the command channel. Chen's voice emerged from the speakers, carrying the slight static distortion that indicated transmission from deep space. Commander Zeth Kara, this is Admiral Chen, reporting from Task Force Phantom. We've completed reconnaissance of the Andromeda Relay Station and are ready to proceed with Phase 7 of Operation Prometheus. The operation names alone had become a source of fascination and unease among Alliance command staff. Unlike the logical designation systems used by other species, human operation names seemed designed to invoke psychological responses. Prometheus, Damocles, Nemesis, Ragnarok. Each name carried implications that made even experienced warriors uncomfortable. Admiral, Zeth Kara replied, please confirm your current tactical situation. Alliance intelligence indicates heavy Devourer presence in your operational area. Chen's laugh carried clearly across the channel, a sound that Zeth Kara had learned to associate with impending impossibility. Heavy presence confirmed, Commander. Approximately 40 enemy vessels protecting what our analysis suggests is their primary research and development facility. They're studying captured Alliance technology, trying to develop countermeasures for conventional tactics. 40 ships against how many of your vessels? 1. The silence in the war room was absolute. Zeth Kara's staff exchanged glances that ranged from disbelief to growing acceptance that humans operated by entirely different rules of engagement. Admiral, General Vorthak's voice carried across the channel from his position at the tactical display. Surely you're not proposing to attack 40 enemy vessels with a single ship. Not attack, General. We're proposing to destroy the facility and eliminate the enemy fleet using what humans call leverage. One ship, properly positioned and equipped, can accomplish what an entire battle group might fail to achieve through conventional assault. Dr. Vasquez's voice joined the transmission. General, we've spent months studying Devourer psychology and tactical doctrine. They're expecting us to engage them with superior firepower, advanced weaponry, and numerical advantage. They're not prepared for what we're actually planning to do. Which is? Zethkara asked, though experience had taught him that human tactical explanations often raised more questions than they answered. We're going to convince them to destroy the facility themselves. Colonel Washington replied matter-of-factly. The war room fell silent again. Even by human standards, this sounded impossible. Admiral Chen continued the explanation with characteristic patience. The research facility is built into an asteroid that's been hollowed out and reinforced. It's protected by energy shields, defensive weapons, and the 40-ship escort fleet. Direct assault would require massive resources and accept heavy casualties. So instead, Dr. Vasquez added, we're going to make them think the asteroid is about to explode and take their entire fleet with it. Think? General Vorthak's confusion was evident. You mean deception? We mean the complete psychological manipulation of an enemy force. Zhang's voice carried grim satisfaction. The Devourers have spent eons fighting rational enemies who engage in logical tactical exchanges. They have no experience with opponents who weaponize fear, uncertainty, and paranoia. Chen resumed control of the briefing. Commander, we've modified our ship to broadcast false sensor readings indicating catastrophic structural failure in the asteroid, cascading system failures, radiation leaks, and imminent gravitational collapse. To Devourer sensors, it will appear that the entire facility is about to become a miniature black hole. And you believe they'll abandon their defensive positions based on false sensor data? Zethkara asked. Not abandon, Washington corrected. Evacuate. There's a significant difference. Abandonment suggests tactical withdrawal. Evacuation suggests panic, Dr. Vasquez elaborated. We've studied recordings from previous Devourer encounters with gravitational anomalies. Their response protocols prioritize preservation of the collective consciousness above all other considerations. When faced with existential threats to the hive mind, they become predictably cautious. Predictably? General Vorthak sounded skeptical. Absolutely, Chen confirmed. When the Devourers believe they're facing imminent destruction, they follow specific evacuation procedures designed to preserve maximum information for the collective. They'll remove all research data, withdraw their ships to safe distance, and then, she paused dramatically, destroy the facility themselves to prevent valuable technology from falling into enemy hands. The elegance of the plan slowly dawned on Zethkara. You're going to trick them into destroying their own research facility by making them think it's going to explode naturally, while simultaneously eliminating their escort fleet, capturing their research data, and demonstrating to the hive mind that even their most secure installations are vulnerable to human tactics, Zhang added with obvious satisfaction. But what about their sensors? The Alliance tactical officer asked. Won't they detect that your readings are false? Eventually, Dr. Vasquez admitted. But by then it will be too late. We're also broadcasting a computer virus disguised as emergency evacuation protocols. Once their ships start receiving our false sensor data, the virus will propagate through their communication network and corrupt their ability to distinguish between real and fabricated threats. Admiral, Chen's voice carried the tone of someone explaining an art form. This is what humans call operational deception. We're not just trying to win a single battle. We're trying to make the enemy doubt the reliability of their own senses. Every future engagement will be complicated by their uncertainty about whether they're responding to real threats or human manipulation. The implications were staggering. Zethkara realized he was witnessing the transformation of interstellar warfare, from a contest of technological superiority to a battle of psychological manipulation. Admiral, he said slowly, you're describing tactics that will fundamentally change how space warfare is conducted. The Devourers will be forced to question every sensor reading, every tactical assessment, every strategic decision. Exactly, Chen replied. Commander, there's something you need to understand about human military doctrine. We don't just fight to win individual battles. We fight to break the enemy's will to continue fighting. Every engagement is designed to make the next engagement easier. Psychological warfare on a strategic scale, General Vorthak muttered, his voice carrying tones that suggested he was beginning to understand why other species found humans disturbing. General? Washington's voice carried an edge that made Zeth Kara's secondary heart skip beats. You still don't understand the scope of what we're doing. This isn't just psychological warfare. This is something humans call fourth-generation warfare. We're not fighting the Devourer ships or weapons or even their tactics. We're fighting their ability to think clearly. Dr. Vasquez provided technical clarification. Every virus we introduce, every false sensor reading we broadcast, every impossible tactical maneuver we execute, creates doubt in the hive mind's decision-making processes. We're essentially teaching a collective consciousness to experience anxiety. The war room had become completely silent except for the soft hum of electronic systems. Every officer present was contemplating the implications of weaponizing uncertainty itself. Admiral, Zeth Kara said finally, how can the Alliance support your operation? Chen's response carried warmth mixed with predatory anticipation. Commander, we need you to do what humans call selling the deception. Position Alliance ships at maximum sensor range and begin broadcasting standard evacuation warnings. Make it look like you're responding to the same emergency signals we're sending to the Devourers. You want us to help convince them that their facility is really going to explode? We want you to help us demonstrate that when humans decide something needs to be destroyed, reality becomes negotiable, Zhang replied. As the transmission ended, Zeth Kara looked around the war room at his staff. Every face, whether scaled, crystalline, or organic, showed the same expression of dawning comprehension mixed with instinctive unease. They were witnessing the emergence of a species that didn't just fight wars. They fought the very concept of predictability itself. Somewhere in the darkness of space, a single human ship prepared to convince 40 enemy vessels that their most secure installation was about to become a threat to their own existence. And the truly terrifying part, Zeth Kara realized, was that the humans seemed to consider this just another routine military operation. The aftermath of Operation Prometheus exceeded even human projections for psychological impact. Within 18 standard hours, the Devourer research facility had been completely evacuated. Its escort fleet had withdrawn to what they considered safe distance, and their own weapons had reduced the asteroid to radioactive debris. The Devourers had successfully destroyed their most important technological development center based entirely on fabricated sensor readings and human manipulation. But it was what happened next that truly demonstrated the scope of human strategic thinking. Commander. Zeth Kara received the report while standing in his private quarters, staring out at the stars that no longer seemed as distant or as peaceful as they once had. His aide, the crystalline being from Praxis 7, entered with data tablets that contained intelligence gathered from the operation's aftermath. Commander, the aide chimed, the human vessels have transmitted their final operational report. The psychological impact appears to be extensive. Zeth Kara accepted the tablets, scanning data that made his primary hearts race with a mixture of admiration and concern. Summarize the intelligence findings. Sir, Devourer fleet movements across 7 sectors have become increasingly erratic. They're conducting sensor sweeps for threats that don't exist, establishing defensive perimeters around facilities that aren't under attack, and the aide paused. Consulting additional data, they appear to be questioning the reliability of their own collective consciousness. The implications were staggering. The hive mind that had coordinated Devourer operations across galactic distances for millions of years was beginning to doubt its own perceptions. There's more, sir, the aide continued. Dr. Vasquez's computer viruses are still propagating through their networks. Each time they attempt to purge the false data, the viruses adapt and create new forms of confusion. Their communication systems are essentially learning to lie to themselves. Zeth Kara set down the tablets and activated his personal communicator. Get me Admiral Chen, the response came quickly, transmitted from somewhere in the outer spiral arm, where human task forces continued their relentless campaign of psychological warfare. Commander Zeth Kara, Chen's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone whose plans were proceeding exactly as designed. I assume you've received our operational summary. Admiral, I've reviewed the data. But I need clarification on something that concerns the Alliance High Command. How far are you planning to push this psychological campaign? There was a pause before Chen responded, and when she did, her voice carried undertones that made Zethkara wish he hadn't asked the question. Commander, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about human objectives in this conflict. Most species seem to believe we're fighting to defeat the Devourers. We're not. We're fighting to break them. Break them? Colonel Washington's voice joined the transmission. Commander, the Devourers are a collective consciousness that has existed for millions of years. Their identity is based on absolute confidence in their technological and tactical superiority. Take away that confidence and you don't just defeat them. You fundamentally alter what they are as a species. Dr. Vasquez provided technical context. We've been studying the psychological profiles of hive mind entities. Individual consciousness can recover from trauma through adaptation and learning, but collective consciousness that loses faith in its own decision-making processes enters what humans call a death spiral of self-doubt. You're describing psychological warfare on a civilizational scale, Zethkara said. Barely believing his own words, we're describing victory, Chen replied simply. Commander, there's something about human military doctrine that I don't think the Alliance fully comprehends. When we fight, we don't just seek to win battles or capture territory. We seek to ensure that our enemies never want to fight us again. Zhang's voice carried the grim satisfaction of someone explaining professional expertise. It's called deterrence through demonstration. Make the enemy understand that fighting humans isn't just dangerous. It's futile. Show them that we can turn their own strengths against them, corrupt their own systems, and make them doubt their own perceptions. But the Devourers aren't just another species, Zethkara protested. They're a galactic threat that has consumed entire civilizations. Were, Washington corrected. They were a galactic threat. Now they're a confused, paranoid collective consciousness that can't trust its own sensors, can't rely on its own communications, and can't predict what humans will do next. Admiral Chen's voice took on the tone of someone delivering a lecture to military students. Commander, let me explain something about human strategic thinking. Every weapon we develop, every tactic we employ, every operation we conduct is designed with one goal: to ensure that future conflicts are unnecessary. By making potential enemies too afraid to fight you? By making potential enemies understand that fighting humans means entering a contest where the rules change faster than they can adapt, where their advantages become liabilities, and where victory becomes indistinguishable from defeat. Dr. Vasquez added scientific context. We've introduced what humans call mimetic warfare into devourer consciousness, ideas that replicate and mutate within their information networks, creating persistent doubt about their own capabilities. Even if they purge every virus, eliminate every false sensor reading, and restore their communication systems, the ideas will remain. What ideas? Zethkara asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. The idea that humans can infiltrate any system, Zhang replied. The idea that any sensor reading might be false. The idea that their technological superiority is an illusion that humans can shatter at will. Most importantly, the idea that in any conflict with humans, the Devourers will be fighting an enemy that learns faster than they can adapt. The scope of what the humans had accomplished was becoming clear to Zethkara. They hadn't just defeated Devourer fleets. They had infected Devourer consciousness with permanent uncertainty. Admiral, he said slowly, you've essentially weaponized doubt itself. We've weaponized evolution, Chen corrected. Commander, every species in the galaxy has developed advanced technology, sophisticated weapons, and complex tactical systems. But only humans have spent their entire evolutionary history fighting enemies that thought exactly like they did. We're the only species that learned to win by constantly changing the rules of engagement. Washington elaborated. The Devourers mastered warfare as it existed millions of years ago. Fixed tactics, predictable strategies, technological superiority determining victory. They never learned to fight enemies that innovate in real time, that turn disadvantages into advantages, that treat impossible odds as interesting challenges. And now? Zethkara asked. Now they're learning, Dr. Vasquez replied. Every engagement teaches them that human tactics are unpredictable. Every victory shows them that technological superiority means nothing against creative adaptation. Every operation demonstrates that fighting humans means fighting an enemy that rewrites the rules of warfare faster than they can understand the changes. Admiral Chen's final transmission carried the weight of inevitability. Commander, we've received intelligence that the Devourer High Command is considering something unprecedented in their civilization's history. Negotiated withdrawal from Alliance space. They're considering retreat? They're considering survival, Zhang corrected. The hive mind has concluded that continued conflict with humans represents an existential threat to their civilization. Not because we can destroy them militarily, but because we can destroy their ability to think clearly. The communication channel filled with static as the human ships moved beyond transmission range, leaving Zeth Kara alone with the implications of what he had learned. He walked to his viewport and stared out at stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, wondering if any of them had ever encountered a species quite like humanity. His aide entered quietly, carrying additional intelligence reports. Commander, we're receiving transmissions from multiple sectors. Devourer fleets are withdrawing from contested systems. They appear to be consolidating around their core territories. Consolidating or retreating. The distinction appears to be academic, sir. The strategic effect is the same. For the first time since the war began, Alliance territory is expanding rather than contracting. Zeth Kara nodded, still staring at the stars. Somewhere out there, human ships continued their campaign of psychological warfare, teaching the galaxy's most feared enemy to experience something they had never known in millions of years of existence. The fear of fighting an opponent they couldn't understand or predict. The humans had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. They had defeated a technologically superior enemy, not through better weapons or superior numbers, but by introducing concepts that the enemy's collective consciousness couldn't process: uncertainty, adaptability, and the terrifying possibility that in any conflict with humans, the rules of engagement would change faster than anyone could follow. As Zeth Kara watched, distant stars flickered with the energy signatures of ships moving through hyperspace. Some were Devourer vessels retreating from battles they no longer understood. Others were human ships pursuing an enemy that was learning to fear the very concept of predictability. The war, he realized, was entering its final phase, not because either side was approaching military victory, but because one side had convinced the other that continued fighting represented a threat to their sanity itself. 1 year after the first human, ships had departed for Devourer territory. With nothing but primitive weapons and impossible confidence, the war was officially declared over. The ceremony took place aboard the neutral space station Harmony, with representatives from every Alliance species present to witness what many considered the most unusual conclusion to a galactic conflict in recorded history. Commander, Zeth Kara stood in the observation gallery, watching through reinforced transparasteel as the formal proceedings unfolded in the main assembly hall below. The Devourer delegation consisted of 3 massive cybernetic entities, their quantum crystalline forms reflecting light in patterns that indicated extreme caution. Across from them sat the human representatives, Admiral Chen, Colonel Washington, Dr. Vasquez, and Commander Zhang, looking remarkably ordinary compared to the exotic forms surrounding them. The contrast was striking. The Devourers had arrived with an escort of 12 ships, sensor arrays constantly scanning for threats, their formation patterns suggesting they expected attack at any moment. The humans had arrived in a single unarmed transport vessel, with Admiral Chen casually reading what appeared to be a physical book during the approach journey. "The formal accords are ready for signing," announced High Chancellor Vexithana, her crystalline form refracting light in patterns that indicated ceremonial solemnity. "This agreement establishes permanent borders between Alliance space and Devourer territory, with specific provisions for non-aggression and technological exchange protocols. But it was the unwritten terms that made this treaty unprecedented in galactic history. The Devourers weren't surrendering due to military defeat or resource exhaustion. They were withdrawing because they had concluded that humans represented a form of warfare they couldn't comprehend or counter. High Admiral Kethvar approached the podium, his ancient Valerian form moving with dignity, despite the weight of historical significance. "Before we formalize these accords, perhaps the architects of our victory would share their perspectives on the conflict and its resolution." Admiral Chen rose gracefully, her simple dress uniform contrasting sharply with the ornate ceremonial garments worn by other delegates. Honored representatives, I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what we accomplished in this war. We didn't defeat the Devourers through superior technology or overwhelming force. We introduced them to concepts that their civilization had never encountered. The lead Devourer entity, designation Prime Consciousness Alpha, spoke through translation matrices that converted quantum thought patterns into audible speech. The human admiral speaks accurately. Your species conducts warfare in ways that exceed our analytical parameters. Your tactics demonstrate adaptability that approaches randomness. Admiral Chen's smile carried the warmth of someone explaining a favorite subject to interested students. Alpha, with respect, our tactics aren't random. They're evolutionary. Every engagement taught us more about your capabilities while simultaneously teaching you less about ours. Colonel Washington stepped forward. If I may elaborate, the fundamental difference between human and Devourer military doctrine is temporal perspective. You plan operations based on millions of years of successful conquest. We plan operations based on the assumption that any tactic used twice becomes predictable. Dr. Vasquez activated a holographic display showing tactical evolution charts. The Devourer approach to warfare is based on refinement, perfecting existing strategies until they achieve maximum efficiency. The human approach is based on revolution, constantly developing new strategies that make previous approaches obsolete. Prime consciousness. Alpha's form shifted to patterns that suggested deep contemplation. Your statement implies that human warfare is based on perpetual change rather than optimized stability. Exactly, Commander Zhang replied. Alpha, your civilization achieved tactical perfection millions of years ago, but perfection by definition cannot adapt. When faced with an enemy that changes faster than you can analyze, perfection becomes vulnerability. The implications rippled through the assembly. Representatives from dozens of species were beginning to understand that they had witnessed something far more significant than a military victory. They had observed the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to existence itself. Chancellor Vexithana spoke carefully, her crystalline form displaying patterns of deep unease. Admiral Chen, are you suggesting that human military success is based on instability? Chen's expression grew thoughtful. Chancellor, I would describe it as adaptive instability. Humans learned long ago that survival depends not on achieving perfect solutions, but on developing the ability to create new solutions faster than problems can evolve. But such an approach seems... The representative from Harmony searched for appropriate terminology. Exhausting. How does a civilization function when everything is constantly changing? By treating change as the only constant, Washington replied. Our entire culture is built around the assumption that whatever we know today will be insufficient tomorrow. Our education systems teach adaptation rather than memorization. Our technology is designed for modification rather than perfection. Our military doctrine assumes that any successful tactic will eventually be countered. Dr. Vasquez provided scientific context. Most species develop technology and tactics linearly. Each advancement builds upon previous achievements. Humans develop them exponentially. Each advancement opens multiple new possibilities that we explore simultaneously. Prime consciousness. Alpha's form flickered. With patterns that suggested computational strain, such an approach requires enormous intellectual resources. How does your species maintain coherent civilization while constantly altering fundamental assumptions? Admiral Chen's smile grew wider, and for a moment Zeth Kara was reminded of the predatory satisfaction he had learned to associate with human tactical discussions. Alpha, that's the key to understanding human civilization. We don't maintain coherent civilization despite constant change. We maintain coherent civilization through constant change. Elaborate, requested the Devourer entity, though its tone suggested uncertainty about whether it actually wanted clarification. Commander Zhang stepped forward, his scarred face bearing an expression that made several delegates unconsciously retreat. Alpha, human civilization has survived ice ages, supervolcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, plagues, wars, and social upheavals that would have destroyed more stable societies. We survived because we learned that the only way to guarantee survival is to assume that current conditions are temporary. Your species treats uncertainty as an advantage rather than a threat. Prime consciousness, Alpha observed. its patterns shifting to configurations that suggested something approaching awe. We treat uncertainty as the natural state of existence, Chen corrected. Alpha, every human child learns that the world will be different when they grow up than it was when they were born. We don't just accept change, we expect it, plan for it, and exploit it. The silence that followed was profound. Representatives from civilizations spanning millions of years were contemplating the existence of a species that treated perpetual revolution as normal social development. Finally, High Admiral Kethvar spoke, his ancient voice carrying harmonics of deep respect mixed with instinctive wariness. Admiral Chen, I must ask directly, what prevents such a civilization from becoming a threat to galactic stability? Chen's expression grew serious for the first time during the proceedings. Admiral, that's a question that goes to the heart of human values. We've learned that the power to change everything comes with the responsibility to consider the consequences of change. Ethics, Dr. Vasquez added. Humans developed elaborate moral frameworks precisely because we recognized our own capacity for transformation. We learned that unlimited power requires unlimited restraint. Washington nodded agreement. Our military doctrine includes concepts like proportional response, protection of civilians, and rules of engagement specifically because we understand that our tactical capabilities could be used destructively against peaceful civilizations. But more importantly, Zhang concluded, we learned that the most effective form of security is helping other species develop their own adaptive capabilities rather than conquering them. Allies who can think creatively are more valuable than subjects who can only follow orders. Prime Consciousness Alpha processed this information for several long moments before speaking again. The human delegation suggests that your species views galactic civilization as a collaborative rather than competitive environment. Exactly, Chen replied. Alpha, humans learned something important during our evolution. The strongest societies are those that include the widest variety of perspectives and capabilities. Diversity isn't just tolerating differences, it's recognizing that differences create strength. The formal treaty signing proceeded with ceremonial gravity, but Zethkara found his attention focused on the broader implications of what had been revealed. The humans hadn't just ended a war. They had introduced the galaxy to an entirely new model for civilization itself. As the ceremonies concluded and delegates began departing for their respective territories, Admiral Chen approached Zethkara in the observation gallery. Commander, she said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. I wanted to thank you personally for trusting human judgment when everything we did seemed impossible. Zethkara clasped her hand carefully, still marveling at the strength in such a small appendage. Admiral, I've learned that impossible is a relative concept when applied to human operations. Chen's laugh carried genuine warmth. Commander, there's something I want you to understand about what happened in this war. We didn't defeat the Devourers because we're superior to them. We defeated them because we're different from them in ways that proved tactically significant. Different how? They achieved perfection and spent millions of years defending it. We achieved adaptability and spent thousands of years improving it. When those two philosophies collide, adaptability wins because perfection can't learn new responses. As Chen departed with her delegation, Zethkara remained in the observation gallery, watching ships depart for distant stars. The war was over, but its implications would reshape galactic civilization for generations to come. Humanity had revealed that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't superior technology or overwhelming numbers. It was the ability to change faster than opponents could adapt, to treat uncertainty as opportunity, and to transform disadvantages into advantages through creative thinking. The galaxy would never be quite the same. And somehow, Zethkara reflected as he watched the human transport disappear into hyperspace, that seemed exactly the way humans preferred it.